We all love to talk about our favorite things, right? Stuff like BTS or LeBron James, or the latest release on Fortnite, or the best TikTok trends. Even though we all have different things we like to talk about, I think the reason we talk so much about them is the same for all of us. We want other people to experience what we love. Whether it's a movie we saw, a place we visited, or sports we play, we love talking about the things that we have personally experienced in a positive way. And I think that's because we want other people to experience those things in the same way that we did. Now, I know we're all here at church together for a lot of different reasons. Well, I'd say that no matter why we're here week after week, talking about God could be a helpful habit to develop. Why? Because the more we talk about God, the more we'll know Him, and the more we know Him, the more we'll want other people to know Him as well. We'll want them to experience what we've experienced. But for many of us, the idea of talking about God or our faith can be really scary. Maybe we're afraid to talk about God because we really don't know how to explain what we think. We're not exactly sure how to start or how to answer questions that people might ask us. We feel like we don't know enough big words or Bible verses or points about Christianity to even start. We talk about God, but we're not even sure what words we should use. Or maybe we're afraid it will be awkward. Maybe nobody likes being stuck in an awkward moment, and that is for sure. We're afraid it will happen to make other people uncomfortable or even offended. Maybe we're curious about what it means to follow Jesus, but we're not sure how to bring it up. And honestly, we're afraid that even asking somebody will make it weird. Or it could be that we're not sure what we think. Even if we believe in God or think we understand Him, we're not positive we have it all figured out. And we don't want to look like we don't know what we're talking about. So often we treat God like a math problem. We think we have to know all the details in order to get the right answer. And until we have all those details, we don't want to talk about it. So instead, we decide to say nothing. But what if I told you that you don't need to be afraid of talking about God? In fact, even if you aren't sure what you think about God, one of the best ways to get to know Him is to talk about Him with other people. Now, if that totally freaks you out, I get it. But what if you thought about it this way? When you talk about God, you don't have to talk about what you know. You can talk about who you know. In fact, that's actually what helped the church get started. The early church was started by a handful of people who were passionate about one specific person, and that person was Jesus. Early believers didn't necessarily know the answer to every single question about Jesus, but they didn't let that stop them. So they talked about Him a lot, even when they didn't know all the details. And while this was going on, a few religious leaders noticed something. Take a look what they had to say. It was obvious to the religious leaders that Peter and John were uneducated. Peter and John didn't know as many details as other people might have. They probably wouldn't have won a debate about all the facts on Jesus' time on earth, but they did know who Jesus was. They knew Him personally. They experienced Him, and that's what they talked about. That's what left the people who were listening so amazed. The more Peter and John talked about Jesus, the more everyone around them not only realized that Peter and John knew what they were talking about, but also who they were talking about. In other words, they knew God. And because of how Peter and John talked about God, many of the people around them wanted to know God as well. And here's what's really cool. I think the same can be true for us. We may not know all the answers, but we know God. We can talk about what we've experienced. We can share what we hope to learn about Him as we grow in our faith. We can talk about Him not just so other people will know Him, but so that they will know Him better too, because talking about God helps us know Him better. The more we share our thoughts, experiences, and even questions about God with others, the more we'll be challenged to keep talking, to keep growing, and to continue getting to know God ourselves. We'll make sharing God and learning more about Him a part of our everyday life, because talking about God helps us know Him better. So how do we make a habit out of talking about God? How can we make talking about Him a part of our everyday faith? Well, first, we can remember that we don't need to know everything to talk about God. Peter and John weren't the smartest or the most educated people. They were just two guys who knew Jesus. They got to know God in real ways, and they let that be their motivation to talk to others about Him. It wasn't that they could have all the right answers or look really impressive. It was so that both they and the people they were talking to could get to know God better. And we can do the same. We can focus on who we're talking about instead of worrying about needing to know all of the answers and all of the details. We can just share more about who He is and what His character is like. So if we don't know how to talk about God, the guy who created the world, maybe instead we can talk about how creative God is to make the world we live in. If we can't explain how God forgives us, we can share about how it feels to be forgiven and loved unconditionally by Him. While we may not be able to explain why the bad stuff happens, we can talk about how God comforts and supports us when we face hard times. You see, we don't need to know the answers to everything that's related to God. All we need is to share what we know about Him from having a relationship with Him. Now, I get that for some of us that isn't easy. If you're not so sure about all this God stuff, talking about how you've known or experienced Him may not feel like something that you can do, and that's okay. My encouragement to you would be to start talking about what you're not sure of. If you aren't sure that God made the world, talk to someone about it. If you're not sure that Jesus forgives us, talk to someone about it. If you're not sure that God can comfort you when bad things happen, talk to someone about it. Finally, one last thing we can learn from Peter and John is that we can talk to God by sharing what He's done in our lives. And what I love the most about today's story is when Peter and John talked about Jesus, people recognized immediately that they had been with Him. These guys may not have been able to answer everybody's questions, but they could talk about what they had experienced. And this is what they called their stories. And so can you. You can talk about Jesus and talk about what's happened in your life. If you've seen Him answer a prayer in your life, share that. If you've seen Him change your attitude towards someone, talk about that. If you've ever seen Him do something amazing in your life or the life of someone you know, tell people about it. Tell your stories. Talk about what you've experienced. Focus on who God is to you. Peter and John kept talking about God, and thousands of people's lives were changed because of it. They didn't have all the answers, but they did have their experiences. And the more that they talked, the more stories they had to tell. In fact, they eventually both wrote all about it. And those stories have been around for more than 2,000 years. They've helped millions upon millions of people get to know God better simply by just talking about Him. So remember, talking about God won't just help others know Him better. Talking about God helps us know Him better too. And when we make talking about God a habit, getting to know Him better becomes a part of our everyday faith.